Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. Brentford's dynamic duo have lit up the Premier League once again this season. But with Thomas Frank admitting Bryan Mbeumo could be sold this summer, what does the future hold for him and strike partner Yoane Wissa? Joining me today on The Athletic, we've got Jay Harris and we've also got Liam Tharme as well. Jay, let's talk about Brentford. And let's talk about I was thinking, when Ivan Toney left, what would they do? Would they go in and buy someone else, or would they carry on doing what they've done? And look, Wissa and Mbeumo, 18 goals already this season individually. I mean, that is quite interesting, but also how Thomas Frank has managed to mould this team in their likeness.
Well, they did sign someone to replace Ivan Toney before he'd even left the building, but he just got injured straight away in pre-season, Igor Thiago. So maybe if Thiago had been fit, this season would have played out slightly differently. But what I hope people haven't forgotten is that when Toney was banned for breaching the FA's gambling rules, that first half of the 23-24 season, and Mbeumo and Wissa started really well. They went on this, I can't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but they went on this run of games where every time Toney wasn't playing, one of them would score. And then their momentum was completely disrupted that season by Mbeumo suffering an ankle injury in December, and he was out for 3 months. And Brentford, for the rest of that season, it was just about survival. Whereas this season, they've both been pretty much available, I think, for every game. I know Mbeumo started all 36 games in the Premier League this season. So it's been about, they've been consistently available. Thomas Frank, if you look back to when he first started as a head coach at Brentford, he had that dynamic front three of Neil Maupay, Bryan Mbeumo, Ollie Watkins, Said Benrahma as well. And I always think that's his favourite type of centre forward, a Watkins-esque profile, who's a bit of a hybrid. He can run the channels, he can play centrally, he can play out wide. Watkins is a converted winger. That's not to downplay Toney's strengths, but Brentford adapted to Toney. I think it suited them their first couple of seasons in the Premier League. But now I think the way Brentford are set up with Schade as well, it's a more dynamic, fluid, unpredictable front three. And I think that suits Brentford better. And I think it suits Frank far better as well. Yeah,
Brentford's touching European football potentially this season, Liam. I mean, talk to us about how Thomas Frank has made it work. Jay's alluded to some of it there, but also, to get these two working really well and the goals and the output is actually quite impressive.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of how good he is as a coach, really. I mean, there's the benefit, I think, massively that he's been there for so long now, that the structure's definitely there. Remember, he's speaking after the draw against Arsenal earlier on this season, and was saying that, Mbeumo's the second sort of winger he's converted to a striker with sort of decent success, with Watkins, of course, sort of being the first. And it's that adaptability within systems. It's a great buzzword you hear from him in press conferences a lot, which is layers, sort of wanting to... Jay knows, he's heard it a million times. It's kind of a Thomas Frank bingo. It's great. But all he's really talking about there is sort of adding on that attacking side, developing Brentford from, a team who, when they were first in the Premier League, were phenomenal against sort of the big six teams, could play that 3-5-2, drop into a back five, kind of got that notorious set piece sort of tag that came with it, and which was largely complementary, but I guess their theory was, and it makes sense, that look, if you just do that all the time, your ceiling might not be 8th place in the Premier League with 2 games to go. So you look at the team now and the way they play, it's very much a 4-3-3. You've got normally a winger in Keane Lewis-Potter filling in at left back, who I know isn't the topic of this pod, but it just goes to show how attacking they are. And I think they've been particularly good. They had a great start at home, especially this season. Really good at being really vertical in a league now where so many teams play a high line and try to be aggressive. I think that's really sort of benefited them. They've got that pace up top, those quick wingers now, and Mbeumo being one of them. And they play with such fluidity. I remember Jay and I spoke before about sort of Toney's strengths being really specific, and you kind of have to play a certain way, but you've got a bit more freedom with perhaps Mbeumo and Wissa this time.
Okay, well, let's focus on Mbeumo himself. 18 goals and 7 assists in 36 games for him this season. Jay, what makes him so special? As a player they got from Troyes quite a few years ago, and still when they were in the Championship, I imagine. And then, obviously, he's grown with this team in various iterations of this team, actually. What is it that catches the eye of potential buyers when it comes to Bryan Mbeumo?
I think Mbeumo's always been quite talented. So I believe he made his debut for Troyes when they were in League One when he was 18. And then they got relegated. He had a good season. And that's why Brentford signed him. And he had a really good first season in the Championship. Second season maybe underperformed slightly. But firstly, with Mbeumo, he's a very, very hard worker. And I think that's what some people don't quite realise. He works as hard off the ball. as he does on it. Secondly, his positional versatility is quite astounding. We've already alluded to the fact that previously he played in a 2 with Tony in a 3-5-2 system. He mainly plays on the right wing. I've seen him play as a really aggressive wing back in a 3-4-3 system for Brentford. So you're getting a very intelligent player who can adapt to different roles within a team. And he's worked incredibly hard. When I speak to people at Brentford, I said, what's the secret behind Mbeumo? And they say, there's no secret. He just works hard. He pays for his own chef. He does all the tiny details right. And I think the best way you can prove that is that first season in the Premier League. Well, I think I went to every Brentford game that season. He was so frustrating. So let me get this right. He scored 4 goals from an XG of 9.3 in 35 appearances. Yeah. He hit the woodwork league high 7 times. So he was just someone who was a bit erratic, but he was still only 21, 22 years old. He needed the space and the time to grow and develop. And every single season, he's just got better and better and better. This season, he's got 18 goals in the league from an XG of 11. So he's gone from underperforming massively to overperforming it, which is quite astounding. And I was also thinking about what's changed with Mbeumo. And the biggest change is Tony leaving. And I know that sounds so simple.
No, I know what you mean.
But I think I have to point out that it's not just about what Tony did on the pitch. Tony was a cult of personality. Yeah. We all know that. When Eriksen was at Brentford, everybody spoke about Eriksen. Otherwise, it was the Ivan Toney show. And it wasn't just about the goals. It was the celebrations. Like I remember the first goal he scored in the Premier League was against Aston Villa away. And Tony's celebration was a wind-up to the Villa fans because he basically made this gesture that links to Birmingham City. Yeah. When he comes back from his ban, he scores a free kick. He scores twice at the Etihad. The spotlight was drawn to Ivan Toney all the time. So Mbeumo, even when he was playing well, he just wasn't the centre of conversation. And so I think him leaving has just allowed other people to flourish because no one's talking about Ivan Toney anymore. And it sounds so simple, but I think that's quite a key element of it.
Yeah, this player's like 25. Dare I say it? Like, because of his beard, I think he's much older.
Everybody says that, though.
He's like 28, 29, right?
I feel bad.
I do. But Liam, that's a really interesting point because actually by taking something out of the team, it might allow certain other players to step forward. But you know what? It's still not always guaranteed, but actually this is a player you can see incrementally through his stats has got better and better over the seasons.
I think so, and that's kind of the profile, right, that has really come to fruition in the last few years in the Premier League. Maybe now it's shifting back towards that goal scoring number 9, but you had that season a few years ago where Son and Salah shared the golden boot, and that kind of, everyone wanted the wide goal scorer, the player that could kind of do both parts of the game there. And I don't think you can underestimate his creativity either, that he's so good at functioning in, as Jay was saying, sort of various different positions. Or you can look at Wissa and Tony as 2 really different types of striker as well, and saying he can complement either sort of really, really well. And there's not, I think, a huge number of players you can say that about where he gets really good numbers and his output's great. He's, as Jay was mentioning, not being very clinical early on in the Premier League. He's kind of gone the other way now. I think he's about 7 goals over his XG. So he's found a shooting boots, and maybe that's partly through playing so consistently. He's the regular penalty taker now as well, and has scored his penalties well, which of course is going to boost that goal number up. And again, partly because Tony's left. Yeah. So I think quite a few things have all kind of happened in quick succession, which has contributed.
He's
to
also I believe he replaced Tony in Brentford's senior leadership in the dressing room. So even something like that, he's now been bestowed with more responsibility. And when their first season in the Premier League, he was probably one of the youngest players in the team. Now he's one of their peak age players in the team. So that alone, it's like, okay, well, prove yourself that you're the man now. I'm sure Thomas Frank would have said that. He would have said, Ivan's gone. Now, Mbeumo, I want you to be number 1. Show me what you got.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about what he's like off the pitch in just a sec, Jay. But Liam, we talk about Thomas Frank, and Mbeumo's basically quoted to say he didn't even know who Brentford were when they first came in for him. Due respect, if you're playing in the second league in France, maybe you wouldn't. But I'm just wondering what it is about this system, and also their scouting's brilliant at Brentford. We've spoken about that before. That really gets great results out of players. Is it Thomas Frank himself? Is he that convincing to spin it around? But also, I wonder what the pitch is. Come to us, you play good football, and potentially this might not be your end result, but other clubs will be looking at you if you're shining.
Yeah, I think he seems really open-minded. Jay can probably speak even more because he knows Thomas better than I do. Yeah. But there's 2 other great examples in the team. We mentioned Keane Lewis-Potter, someone who he's found a different solution for that didn't quite work when he first came in, took some time to settle. And we've got to mention Mikko Damsgaard as well, as a player that took even more time. And he is a big reason, right, for that Mbeumo and Vissa's success, because they're not always having to drop in. They can play on that last line. They've got that Eriksen style creating out in midfield. His assist numbers are immense. But you watch him in build-up too. Sort of, the fullbacks will push on. Sometimes you've got all those strikers on the last line who will drop in, receive the ball, turn out of pressure, and he can play a through ball, or he can sort of link the play. So I think, like Frank is clearly seeming to sort of mould these players really well to the system, and the system to the players. You tend to get, I think, coaches being a little bit more towards one end of either this is our philosophy, this is our style, I'm going to fit you in however that needs to be, or saying, maybe more Ancelotti, like, I'll work with whatever I've got players-wise and build the system. I think Frank's somewhere in the middle, and that I think is a really healthy balance.
Yeah.
So just in terms of the pitch, so when I did the documentary on Brentford a couple of years ago, spoke to some of the senior players who've been around a little bit longer, including Norgard, told me quite a funny story that... So Brentford moved to their new stadium in 2020, and they upgraded their training ground in December 2022 during the World Cup. And before then, the facilities at Griffin Park were dilapidated, and
well put.
the training ground at Jersey Road was basically a collection of cabins. So what the senior figures at the club would do, the directors of football, Phil Giles, Rafa Sankerson, technical director Lee Dykes, they'd often meet players and their agents in hotels or slightly nicer locations in around Richmond and Brentford and West London. They wouldn't really take them to the training ground or the stadium. That's changed now.
For people listening in America, Richmond is very upmarket.
Well, Ted Lasso, they'll know.
Yeah,
through,
exactly.
They'll know
Very
about
true.
it through
Very
that.
true.
So it doesn't really surprise me that Mbeumo didn't know of Brentford, and he probably wasn't shown Griffin Park and where he was going to play. But in terms of their pitch, Brentford's pitches are quite legendary. When I speak to sources, what they do is they'll analyse up to 100 games sometimes of a player, and they'll colour code it so it'll be green for a good performance and red for a bad one. And I think players and their representatives really value the constructive criticism that they receive. And also, if you're Mbeumo and you're playing in the second division of France, you're probably not thinking that someone's going to go in with that analytical an eye, and so that alone you probably appreciate. And then Brentford, and Thomas Frank has said this many times, are a selling club. And Thomas Frank will say there's probably only 10 clubs in the world that aren't a selling club, Real Madrid, Barcelona, etc. They know where they are in football's food chain, and so they'll tell players, and they can give the example. We had Ben Rama for a couple of years. He moved on, he went to West Ham. We had Ollie Watkins for a couple of years. He moved to Aston Villa. He became an England international. Ivan Toney joined us. He, scored 20 goals in the Premier League. He became an England international. He got a massive move to Saudi Arabia. So you can clearly see that when it's right for Brentford, they'll not block a player's pathway. Of course, at times they'll want to keep that player, but they also know when the time is right, they'll say, okay, thank you for your service, and we'll find to let you go. And maybe that will happen this summer, because Mbeumo has been there for 6 years now.
Yeah, for sure. Let's peel behind the curtain a little bit. What's he like away from the pitch? I've seen several interviews with Mbeumo, and he cuts a shy figure. Do you know what I mean? Even though he wears a lot of weight on his shoulders, he does cut a shy figure. I wonder if he's like that off the pitch. He seems quite analytical to me anyway, but I don't know what you see.
Yeah, no, he is quite a quiet guy, quite a shy guy. He plays the piano at Brentford's training ground.
No way.
Yeah, there's videos on their social media. I know he's quite big into chess as well.
Yeah.
He plays a lot of video games and he live streams them on Twitch. So it seems like, I'm not going to say he's a bit of a loner, but sometimes keeps himself to himself. But the exception to that rule would be Wissa. They've got a fantastic relationship off the pitch. I don't know if they're exactly next door neighbours, but they live extremely close to each other. It might be a couple of doors down. Vissa's kids, I believe, call him Uncle Brian.
Oh, man.
I've seen them all leave.
That's very African, though.
It's very,
so
very
African.
Afro-Caribbean. I've seen them all leave the stadium together in a big group. So yeah, he's quite a quiet person, the opposite of Tony in that sense. But one thing Thomas Frank has also always said from the first time I started covering them back in first season when they were in the Premier League, August 2021, so Mbeumo's always been a fantastic trainer. And so that sends a message to other people in the team. It just shows you how focused he is. Even back in the day when they first signed him in 2019, they thought he'd be a good player, but he's never allowed that he's never got carried away with that. He's always been disciplined and worked hard.
Do you think, and this is the big one really, because we're talking about how eyes are on a player like this, is there a potential for him to go any further? I'm talking about, top 5 teams. I'm talking about international potentially. Because the signs are there, but I don't know if the stats will tell us that he can take it to the next level.
I think so. It's always about a scalability thing, right? Are you saying you want him to replicate that output at a top club? You're maybe then looking at perhaps a Grealish style move where people then get very frustrated or upset that he perhaps won't play that exact same role, because if you went to a Big Six Premier League team or a top European side, you're probably not going to be the main attacker in the same way that you were elsewhere. Sure. And there might be issues with that in terms of he's getting the ball and a bit less and fewer opportunities throughout a game. That might impact him. Obviously, it might be balanced out by playing in a more possession dominant team than Brentford. But you look at the range of goals that he scores, the capacity to create, as I said, as well as score. I think he's already added sort of that back post run to his game this season. Seems to do really well to not just be a case of stand wide, get the ball, cut inside 1v1. I think actually finished off both feet quite well. So I think there'll be a lot of clubs that will look at him as a profile where they go, we could use that in a way. And there's not, again, he can be a player that perhaps fits into a variety of systems rather than certain clubs saying, no, we need someone with this very specific bespoke skill set that would work for us.
There's also a player that does well with a good centre forward as well. Do you know what I mean? Like that link up play. Take Wissa out the equation. Is he still that dominant player?
I think so, because there were times last season where Wissa was injured and Mbeumo still carried Brentford. So I think he's just got the all-round qualities where no matter what system he's put in, he'll do a job. And there are teams that need a very specific type of right winger this summer, which Liam alluded to, where they're very good 1v1, cutting inside. There are teams who need maybe a deep runner, and he can do all of those different things. He can play maybe not to the same level centrally, but he could be an option for teams. So that versatility to cover multiple roles, and it's certainly something that clubs tend to be more aware of these years, is something that definitely puts him up there. Okay.
Brentford, look, are very much open to the fact that he might leave, but do they really block players from leaving? We spoke about it earlier. I'm thinking about how they've dealt with Tony. You look at David Raya most recently, and even with the Tony one, it was a tricky one because obviously the ban for a while. I personally thought they priced him a bit too high at the time, which might have stopped potential buyers. There was a lot of stuff in the background, obviously, but this is a player you can tell that they probably know will be going at some point. But how will they deal with that?
I don't know if they priced Tony too high. What happened was Thomas Frank was asked hypothetically how much Ivan Toney would cost.
I remember, yeah.
And he said that if number sixes, Declan Rice and Caicedo are going for £100 million, the strikers are normally more expensive. So
you did price him too high. What are you saying?
I think this is a really big summer for Brentford because with Raya and Tony, although there were slightly different situations, they were both allowed to enter the final year of their contract. So Brentford's club record sale for a long time was Watkins to Villa, which I think was about £28 million with £5 million in add-ons. So you're looking at 33 million. I think Raya went for 30 million with add-ons and Tony went for just over maybe 35 with add-ons. Now, considering Watkins was a championship player at that time and Tony and Raya left Brentford as internationals who'd appeared at major international tournaments, who'd had 2 or 3 years of Premier League football under their belts, they've gone for under their market value. And I think they cannot allow that to happen with Mbeumo and Wissa as well. Now, Mbeumo and Wissa both have 1 year left on their contract, but both have 1 year options. So I think that gives Brentford a layer of security. But this is the summer where they either need to get them to sign extended deals or they need to say, right, we need to sell them this summer. And of course, the Tony thing was complicated by the ban. I think everybody in an ideal world would have said goodbye, Tony, at the end of that 2023 season when he'd been performing exceptionally well.
It was insane.
And it damaged his career and it probably damaged Brentford in terms of the money they could get. So I think this summer they'll be very aware of the fact that, I'd be shocked if they're both there at the start of next season. One of them might be, but I'd be shocked if they're both there. And the same applies to Kevin Schade because he's had a very good end to the season and there's been rumoured interest in him before. So I think it's going to be challenging for them to lose them and replace them, but I think it's something they probably know has been coming.
Yeah.
Now, if Jay would allow me to present an alternative argument to cashing in now, they obviously had a really, really good second season in the Premier League, got a really good number of points, and were in European contention, I think, until quite late. Now, they're currently in 8th spot, and we're recording this obviously before the FA Cup final. So if Crystal Palace beats City, that will mean that 8th spot doesn't go to whoever won't be a European spot. Yeah. But City will probably be favourites in that game. There's good reason to think, okay, Brentford could, and they're currently in that lead position. They play Fulham, of course. They've got a derby game to contend with. But we're looking very feasibly at a situation where Brentford will have European football for, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, the first time in club history. And that one has to be an attractive thing to keep players, to acquire players. Even if you do want to, as you say, cash in on Mbeumo and Wissa, the calibre of player you should be able to attract should be even greater. Of course, you need to add in terms of the squad depth. I don't know, they've had some injuries, especially in defence this season, which, again, is kind of the reason for Lewis Potter and other makeshift things at full-back, Christopher Ayer too. So there'll be sort of different demands and squad building there in terms of how the model works and how you scale that up to European level. But I think you're looking at a time where you say they'll always, or not always, that's perhaps a bit disrespectful, but they can't quickly change that selling model. They don't need to, but I think, they're definitely at a moment where you could say this is the least they've ever needed to sell, and perhaps the biggest reason that why they might stay might be saying, okay, if you've got European football, then perhaps a Spurs or Manchester United that might be realistic options as a natural step up next season might not actually be in terms of the competitions you can play in.
That's a good point, actually, and you brought me on just slightly to my next question, is that what teams are there in the Premier League, if we're looking at the Premier League, would suit the style of a player like Mbeumo?
I thought for a long time he was the Salah replacement at Liverpool. Obviously, he's now just signed a new contract.
Yeah.
I thought that, he's perhaps the kind of profile you think, in comparison to a Brennan Johnson, that Tottenham could really do with to sort of fill that role of, obviously, whereas that's another special subject for Jay, but an option there. But then you kind of think Arsenal probably not one in the Premier League just because of Saka. It just doesn't quite fit. But there's a lot of teams that probably haven't got a right winger of Mbeumo's quality that you go, there's definitely a market there, I think.
Do you think he's at that level where he has to be a starter wherever he goes next? It can't be an understudy because, sometimes you go to the bigger teams and you just got to wait it out a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. 18 goals in the Premier League. You can't move to another club and be, coming off the bench for Saka or Salah. He's earned the right to be given an opportunity at bigger teams. Also Cameroon international, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So he's got that pedigree, and maybe 2 years ago if he'd left, I could have understood it a little bit more, but I think the first half of last season before he got injured where he's exceptional, and the entirety of this season mean that he deserves to be number one wherever he goes.
I'm so interested, if he's to go, and actually you've spoken about it, you think there's a big chance he'll go this summer. What kind of money are we thinking for someone like Bryan Mbeumo? No, because before, no lie, I looked at Transfer Market and the way they sort of like to track a player's progression in terms of money.
Don't tell us the number.
Okay,
and then
this is what I was thinking. I want to see how close you get to it from Transfer Market. He's probably looked at it anyway because that's what he does. Have you?
No.
Okay, cool. What do you think, genuinely?
So we'll talk about Mbeumo first, because then we also need to come on to the topic of Wissa. So Mbeumo turns 26 in August, so he's about to enter the peak years of his career.
There we go. Right.
So you're getting a great investment. You look at the fees that other wingers have gone for in the last few years. The name that immediately jumps out is Mudryk, who went for a similar, and Anthony, who went for similar amounts, and they had no Premier League experience. So I don't think it'd be unreasonable for Brentford to say minimum 65, 70 million. Oh, I think that's fair.
Oh, Liam, what you say?
Well, I think so. The closest example I can think of was Brennan Johnson going from Forest to Spurs. So within a Premier League move, you probably add on a few more. I think he was up into the 50s. Or
he
close
was 50 million.
So I think you can add on an extra % from that. So 70.
Wow. I mean, you guys have marked it much higher. They put him down as 50 million euros.
Wow.
He's not going for 50 million.
No, he's not going to go for that.
Thomas Frank will say, what boot you want?
No, I mean, they're not going to block that. But the reality is, I wonder why this is something I always think about. I wonder why certain players are looked at and they go, well, it's 50 million euros. Is it more to do with the fact that he's Cameroonian, the fact that he's a team like Brentford, for instance? Do you know what I mean? It really annoys me that, because this is clearly a high caliber winger.
For context, I think the way transfer market values work, for anyone that's not actually familiar with it, is like fans can go on and it's like an amalgamation of people say, how much do you think this player is worth? It's not some kind of like model saying from his goal number that can go up. So that's not me slandering everyone that goes in the transfer market, puts in numbers and saying, rate him as high. But that goes to your point, really, I think, about the consensus that, and look, I'm not going to sit here and act as if £50 million isn't a lot of money, because it's obviously a silly amount in football. But as Jay mentioned, that's half what some wingers go for or close to now.
Also, Brentford would ask themselves, if people were offering 50, 55 million pounds for Mbeumo this summer, let's say they get into the Europa Conference League, they'd be saying, is it worth us selling him for 55 million pounds and have to replace him?
See if he shines in that tournament.
Or would we rather keep him and try and do an absolute madness and win and go as deep in that competition as we can do. And I think because that would, Brentford were in League Two, I think 15 years ago, 12 years ago. So for them to even be in the in contention for a Europa Conference League spot is wild. And I think they'd say, actually, do you know what? We're having a time of our lives. Maybe we'll just keep him and see what we can do.
Yeah, for sure. And before we move on, Liam, we have to talk about Wissa. Honestly, what a season he's having. 18 goals, similar to Bryan Mbeumo, 3 assists in the Premier League. It's a different kind of player to Mbeumo, but just as effective. But also, I think just before we started the pod, it got me thinking, does he attract as much attention as Bryan Mbeumo? They're just as prolific, but probably in terms of the world of football, not as attractive.
No, but I think that just comes down to what people like to see, right? Which is a player probably getting on the ball, be prepared to go at someone 1v1. And Mbeumo's sort of running numbers, as Jay mentioned, are off the charts. He's sort of top 3, top 5 for sort of a sprint distance, his high intensity running. I think Wissa naturally has to be a bit smarter about his game, where he's getting in smart positions to score, to link play. And as you said, they're very different, which is, I think, really why they complement each other so well. But I think you'd be silly to, I'm looking at the top scorers list in front of me now. There's only 4 players with more goals than either of them. I think they were the first team this season, and Frank mentioned it in a post-match press conference, to have 2 players with 15 plus. I'm always amazed at how tuned into the stats he is, Thomas Frank. Obviously it's his job and you expect managers to, but he reels stuff sort of straight off off the tongue so easily. Chris Wood, Haaland, Alexander Isak and Mo Salah are the only players with more goals, and obviously 3 of those are out and out number 9s. Wissa, I'd say, really, when you look at his shot map, he just chances wise is that kind of player. But I think maybe because he's a bit smaller, a bit more mobile. I'm thinking about the goal he scored away to Arsenal, where it was a really nice sort of hooked finish off a set piece, that there's real range to what he can do there. I think age counts a tiny bit against him, so he's close to 29 now. He's 28 until he's 29, obviously. But he is probably, I guess, a couple of years ahead of Mbeumo age-wise. Might turn clubs off a little bit just because of resale value. Not that it should, because obviously, you look at Wood, Isak in that group there, not exactly young players. But I think it's a phenomenal return. Yeah.
Wissa had a bit of a super sub tag attached to him in his first couple of years at Brentford, because he was sensational off the bench. But when he started in games, just don't think he had the fitness to do what was required off the ball for a full 90 minutes. And I think that's one of the biggest changes over the last few years. As Liam's mentioned, he's quite slight, he's very mobile, but he's actually very good at dropping deep and holding up the ball, surprisingly good. And I always felt that when it was Tony and Mbeumo and Wissa, when they were at the club all together, you could make a strong argument that Wissa was the most natural finisher. Okay. I think Tony had improved massively over the years and he scored some spectacular goals. But I actually think in and around the box, Wissa was maybe a little bit better. Even the goal he scored against Forest a couple of weeks ago, I'm pretty certain he chips Dean Henderson, doesn't he? Like he's very clever, left-footed and right-footed. And so with Wissa, I think he's definitely better at playing down the middle than Mbeumo. So I almost wonder if teams are more interested in him because he can quite naturally play on the left or the centre. I think Mbeumo's very good on the right. You wouldn't play him through the middle as often. And we know that Nottingham Forest did bid for Wissa in January. And I know a couple of other teams inquired about him, but were told by Brentford no chance.
So Brentford do block players potentially. It's been so vital for them
in the middle of the season. They do. So I just wonder what will happen with Wissa in the summer, because I think I was chatting to Art de Roche, our good friend, about this before, and he said he was quite keen for Arsenal to go in for Wissa in January because peak age player, similar transfer to Trossard when he went 28. Someone who is a win now player. And I wonder if there are a couple of clubs who might look at Wissa and think, okay, he's 29 in September, a year left with an extra option on his deal, so technically 2 years. Could you get him for the 35-40 million pound bracket? And is he a win?
15 goals a season here.
And is he a win now option? And I think that's something to keep an eye on this summer.
Yeah, very interesting. All right. Now, let's talk about Thomas Frank, because, Are we surprised there's not much more noise about him staying or leaving Brentford? We've spoken about Brentford at 8th in the Premier League, potentially European football this season, which is impressive for the size of that club. We've always said he deserves a chance to manage at another level. What are you thinking about this?
That's why I'm not surprised anymore. I was having these exact same conversations 2 years ago when Brentford finished 9th. So he obviously came close to getting the Chelsea job last year. We know he was in the running for that, and Enzo Maresca got in there ahead of him. I was a bit surprised by that decision. I think Frank's evolution as a manager during his time at Brentford sort of proved that he deserves an opportunity to operate with bigger resources and better players. So I'm not as surprised anymore. I still think he deserves that. What he's done this season just underlines that. They had a wobble last season with injuries. They've come back really strongly, which I think is the measure of a manager, that they've had difficulties. They've learnt to adapt. You know, Liam's mentioned a few times, he's converted Keane Lewis Potter into the most unlikely left back going, and Lewis Potter's had a fantastic season. They've been without their first choice left back and right back, Rico Henry and Aaron Hickey, for about 18 months now. Hickey's not played since October 2023. I think Rico Henry's only played a couple of times. So for a manager to be able to cope and adapt and find new solutions with that, I think is remarkable. So I also think that, as you said, he's been at Brentford since December 2016 as an assistant. He's been head coach since October 2018. So coming up to 7 years. He has a fantastic relationship with the director of football, Phil Giles, with the owner, Matthew Benham. And he said a few times before that it would be easy for anybody to be a good manager at Brentford because of the environment and the culture and the way it's set up. And I do think part of him knows I'm never going to have it as good as I've got it at Brentford in terms of my relationship upwards and my relationship with the squad. So I think sometimes he thinks, is the grass always greener on the other side? And he has alluded to that before. I think I remember him saying that exact same phrase in an interview with me last year. Yeah,
but it's so interesting you say that because, I mean, don't get me wrong, very different managers. Xabi Alonso obviously going to Real Madrid. The relationship he's got at Leverkusen is so different to the relationship he's going to have at, Real Madrid. And I guess it's something you've got to let go of, really, in many respects, because you're entering a much more bigger corporate machine if you're going to go to the likes of Manchester United, Arsenal, or whatever.
But then Xabi Alonso has the safety blanket that he was an extremely successful player at Real Madrid, which helps him out. And I remember when Graham Potter was appointed by Chelsea, Thomas Frank was so complimentary about that. I can't remember what the word for word the exact quote was, but he said something along the lines of they could have taken the easy route and appointed Zidane or Pochettino. Spoiler alert, they then did. But he was so enthused that Potter had been given a chance. And I think they get on reasonably well anyways. And then the moment Potter was sacked, in his press conferences, Frank's tone changed. I think he suddenly realised, you can be a very successful manager at an upwardly mobile Premier League club who are in the middle of the table trying to break into that top 8, top 6 bracket, and your reputation can be torched within 6 months. And I think he looked at that and thought, okay, maybe I'm not as keen to jump ship now.
Yeah, you surprised he's not been linked with any bigger jobs?
No, to the point that Jay's kind of made, about kind of the sweet spot he is. And I think the Potter one is a great example of, he's seen other coaches take that risk and sort of gone, okay, that's the way this can play out. And you go, look, there's two ways of them being a head coach or a manager at a European team. Either you get hired by one or you make the club you're at into one. And he's currently really well, you're sort of doing the second one. So I think increasingly now, perhaps ironically compared to maybe if they were sort of more mid-table or not achieving quite as well as they are, I think there's actually even less reason for him now to want to move on, because in terms of the things he could want in a coaching career, I think if you're going to get sort of European football of some form, then that must be massive. That's normally a carrot I think that other clubs could float at you, that he might well have himself, or can at least say, look, maybe if not this season, say they come up a bit short. There's nothing to suggest that this team, once players come back from injury within another window, if they can keep Mbeumo Wissa, that they could go again and perhaps go even better. You're looking at the way perhaps Forest, Villa in recent seasons. I know they're different clubs historically to Brentford, but we're not seeing a big resurgence from some of the big 6 clubs. That window feels really open for teams that are, as you say, upwardly mobile to really achieve that.
If Thomas Frank continues on his current, it doesn't even matter if Thomas Frank continues on his current trajectory. He'll probably get a statue outside Brentford Stadium. I don't think that's an outlandish thing to say, because they've gone on such an incredible journey during his, I think, 9 years at the club in total and 7 years as head coach. They've gone from middle of the Championship to, top half of the Premier League. incredible journey. So I'm not saying he sat there thinking, if I stay at Brentford for a couple more years, my bronze statue, which probably won't even look like me, is going to be outside the stadium.
Don't talk to me about Ronaldo statues.
Exactly. But I'm sure he's aware that he could achieve something so special, and already has done many times with Brentford. And he could tarnish that slightly if he moved at the wrong time, or he didn't move in the right circumstances, etc.
Okay, let's leave it there and stop the Brentford fanboying. This has been actually a joy. Gents, thanks for your time, Jay, Liam, and also thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also leave us a comment. We're back soon. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.